On February 21 of this year, about a month from now, the minimum wage in the state of Michigan is set to increase to $12.48, up about $2 from $10.56, which is what it is right now. This is because the Michigan Supreme Court last year ruled to increase it. This court ruling also ensured that by 2028, it would increase again to $14.97, which, according to virtually every major study, is still not even a livable wage. However, I think increasing it to $14.97 would help a lot of people. Just a disclaimer, there's going to be a lot of numbers in this video, so try to keep up if possible. So along with minimum wage increases, the tipped worker minimum wage is also set to increase to $5.99 in February, and increasing annually until it is phased out completely by 2030. This essentially means that all 100,000 tipped workers in Michigan will make at least the full minimum wage by 2030. And this is obviously wonderful for the 100,000 tipped workers in Michigan who only make 35% of the current full minimum wage, which turns out to be $3.70 per hour. Many of the tipped workers in Michigan, such as waiters, waitresses, only make $3.70 hourly, plus tips, which we all know tips are not predictable and can make it difficult for employees to manage their finances. However, there is a furious battle going on in the Michigan state legislature over the incoming minimum wage increases. Michigan Republicans are fighting back against this, and their reason for doing so I'll talk about in a minute. So House Republicans crafted a bill, and thanks to their newly elected majority, this bill just passed the House. This bill is called House Bill 4001. This bill would increase the minimum wage to just $12 per hour instead of the planned $12.48 per hour. This bill would also have a planned increase in 2029, raising the minimum wage again to exactly $15 an hour. So by 2029, if this bill passes, the minimum wage in Michigan will be $15 an hour. I believe that increasing the minimum wage to $15 per hour is great, actually. And although I don't agree with Republicans on most issues, I think this is a good thing that they want. So although this bill would cut the incoming minimum wage increase by 48 cents in the short term, it would actually increase the minimum wage by 3 more cents than is currently planned by 2029. And I'm kind of indifferent on this part of the bill, because either way, if this bill passes or doesn't pass, we're getting a pretty big minimum wage increase by 2028 or 2029 to either $14.97 an hour or $15, essentially the same thing. So I'm indifferent about this part of the bill. However, the other part of this bill is more divisive. I think the Michigan Senate, when the bill gets there, should not vote to pass this bill because of this other part of the bill. The bill would also stop the increase in tipped workers' minimum wage. It would maintain the current tipped worker minimum wage, which, like I said, is only 35% of the current full minimum wage. This would ensure that many of the 100,000 tipped workers in Michigan would continue making what I would consider starvation wages, which is 35% of $10.56, which is our current minimum wage. And that comes out to $3.70 per hour. Now, there are current laws in Michigan that force employers to pay the difference if a tipped worker does not make enough tips to average the full minimum wage. For example, if a waitress works 40 hours at the $3.70 wage and only makes $100 in tips for the week, she'd only bring home $248 for those 40 hours worked. which is only $6.20 per hour. Now, most employers in Michigan are forced to have to pay the employee the difference up to the minimum wage of $10.56. So most tipped workers in Michigan make a minimum of $10.50 per hour, adjusted for the tips they make. $10.56 is not a livable wage. Waiters and waitresses and other tipped workers cannot foresee how much they will make in tips. Some weeks are slower than others. So we need to abolish the tipped worker minimum wage and create one single minimum wage for all workers in Michigan. Like I said, there's about 100,000 tipped workers in Michigan. All of those workers should be guaranteed to be paid the same as other minimum wage workers, not less. This bill, House Bill 4001, if passed, would screw over all of those workers. If this bill is not passed in the Senate, then the minimum wage will be increased to $14.97 by 2028, which is a good thing. And the best part about it is it will include all workers by 2030. So it will phase out the tipped worker minimum wage, which is what I'm saying we need to do. So please, if you live in Michigan, urge your local state senator, call their office, email their office right now, ask them to vote no on House Bill 4001. There's a local newspaper in Midland, Michigan, that put out an article, and I'll pull it up here. It's from the Midland Daily News. And in this article, they actually interviewed a waitress at a Buffalo Wild Wings in the town. And this waitress essentially argued that if the tipped worker minimum wage is increased, it will de-incentivize customers from tipping. That's the first point she made. The second point is that it would destroy anybody who is making $30, $40, or $50 an hour. A lot of waitresses make really, really good money, $30, $40, $50 an hour, when you take into account all the tips that they get. And what she's arguing is that if you increase the tipped worker minimum wage or just get rid of it completely, a lot of customers will not tip anymore. They'll be like, why am I tipping? You're making a livable wage now, so I'm not going to tip. So it'll bring down the take-home pay of a lot of waitresses. And I think that's a semi-valid point. However, some waitresses make $40, $50 an hour, taking into account their tips, while a lot of other waiters and waitresses take home the minimum wage when tips aren't good on slow weeks, because some weeks are good, some weeks are bad. Essentially what she's arguing is, why would you want to raise the minimum wage for the workers who don't make much? Because you're taking from us, the ones who make a lot of money. If you're making $40 or $50 or more per hour as a waiter or waitress, chances are you're working at a restaurant that has customers that are always going to tip, even if the minimum wage is increased. In the end, yeah, maybe instead of making $50 an hour, maybe you'll make $35 or $40. If your logic is true that increasing the tipped worker minimum wage will de-incentivize customers from tipping, maybe that's true. But by you taking that pay cut, you are quite literally possibly bringing other wait staff out of poverty. Instead of making $10.56 an hour, they're making $15 an hour by 2028. Well, actually by 2030 when this would take into effect. But that's almost a $5 increase for all of those waiters and waitresses who work at restaurants that don't have great tippers, that don't have consistent tips. In my view, I think that's a good trade-off. I think you can sacrifice the potential, right? Like I said, if you're working at a restaurant that has great tippers, if you're working at a restaurant where you're making that much money, it's probably a decent quality restaurant, and customers are always going to tip. And later in this article, they interviewed a general manager at the Molasses Smokehouse, and he said, some customers are always going to tip no matter what, because that's just how they are as a human. But it is going to encourage a lot more people to tip less or not tip at all. Your tipping will reflect the service. Your quality of service will go down with this. And I think the customers understand that. But until it fully takes effect, we won't really see the side of it. Now, this argument doesn't make much sense. Saying that customers tipping less will lower the quality of service? Is he saying that if waiters and waitresses know they're not going to get tipped, their quality of service is going to go down? To put it frankly, I think that's a stupid point. It might be true that they won't make as much in tips, but the minimum wage is going to be increased by 2030 by $5 more per hour. So a lot of the waiters and waitresses that work at the more inexpensive restaurants where there's less tipping, where they're not making as much money, they're going to be making even more money because their minimum wage is increased. So they don't have to fall back on tips to survive. If you're making $15 an hour, you're still going to make some tips. And you're going to be making a livable wage for sure at most restaurants in Michigan. Okay, there was a study done by the Economic Policy Institute, and it essentially predicted what the outcome of these minimum wage increases would have on workers in Michigan. I think this is really interesting. The study shows that, if you follow my mouse here, the increase of the minimum wage by 2028, so increasing it to $14.97 an hour, will impact 563,700 Michigan workers, which is 12.9% of the workforce. And for full-time workers, it will increase their annual wages by $2,384. I know many people that if they had $2,384 extra dollars, it would have gotten them through some really difficult times. For example, an unexpected $500 car repair, or a visit to the ER, an ambulance bill. It's enough to cover some really important things that most people just can't afford nowadays. And just under that number are the tipped workers. And like I said, there's about 100,000. This study says there's 96,700 tipped workers in Michigan. And the increase in the minimum wage for the tipped workers by 2028 would increase full-time workers, tipped workers, their annual wages by $6,669 annually. One common argument against raising the minimum wage is that if you increase workers' wages, it will hurt small businesses who can't afford it. And one common response to that is, if you can't afford to pay your workers a minimum wage that's a livable wage, then you shouldn't be in business. I don't think that's a very effective counter-argument. I think there's a better one. The study shows that if the minimum wage was increased to the $14.97, it would boost wages by more than $1.3 billion in total. So that's $1.3 billion that's in the pockets of the middle class that will be put back into local economies. And if we can find ways to incentivize people better to shop locally, to shop at their local businesses, then those small businesses will be making much more money, and they'll more easily be able to afford to pay their workers the $14.97 or the $15 an hour. It's a win-win because the workers will be making a more livable wage, and the businesses will be benefiting from that $1.3 billion that could be incentivized to be put back into those local and small businesses so that they can afford to pay that. I think that's a much better argument. The study says that the average full-time worker will gain more than $2,300 in annual wages, and full-time tipped workers could earn $6,700 more a year through 2028. Who are the people that would benefit from this? Lower and middle class people who often shop at their local and small businesses. If the average tipped worker is making almost $7,000 more per year, where do you think they're spending the money at? They're going to be spending it in the community. Local and small businesses are going to be benefiting from everyone having more money in their pocket. Because when people have more money, they spend the money. So please, if you live in Michigan, contact your local state senator, urge them to vote no on House Bill 4001.